Folks, again, our next panel is the Quantum Quandary, Risk and Rewards in the Race for Emerging Tech. That's over the next ridgeline. And again, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Gail Zaymak-Lamon, New York Times best-selling author and Chief Marketing Officer for Shield AI. Gail? Also, I'd like to introduce Steve Oren, Chief Technologist, Intel Federal and Intel Corporation. Ilyas Khan, CEO and co-founder of Cambridge Quantum Computing. Sam Visner, Director, National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research Center, known as MITRE. Lieutenant General retired Mike Shields, former Director, Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Organization, JIDO, and part of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And before that, it was the Joint IED Defeat Organization. Mike and I collaborated, what can I say? And then finally, Dr. Kathleen Kiernan, former Assistant Director of the Office of Strategic Intelligence and Information for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, and current CEO of the Kiernan Group. Again, Gail.
What a pleasure to be here with you all today. I think we actually could not have asked for a better panel to cover a whole series of topics. And I think when I first received the bios and was thinking through how to do this, how do we wrangle this much talent around this many subjects that we're all thinking about and have a really coherent discussion? And what I really came to the conclusion of is that everyone is looking at the same sets of issues, but from different points on the circle. And what I'd like to do is just to connect the dots and really have a discussion about how do we think about threats that are emerging with technology that is emerging, and how do we think about 3 T's that we've been talking about: trust, talent, and technology. Because at the center of all of this, you really can't achieve in one of these without the other 2. And I'd like us to start, I think, just really to talk about where we are on the cusp of a revolution in quantum, as this discussion about cyber is actually reaching the mainstream and also challenging us in ever new ways. And as we think about risk and its evolution in an era that is really shaped by technology, and yet some of the threats that we are dealing with are ones that have remained the same for a great deal of time. So I think I'd like to get somewhere between the hype and the hope is where we're going to land this discussion. So I'd like to start, let's start with Sam. This whole discussion about IoT of devices, workplace, the workplace to home, and everywhere in between as people lead ever more mobile lives, right? 5G will see that ecosystem grow even more profoundly. And we've been talking about security concerns. How do you think about the way people are living and working, plus 5G, plus how we think about guarding ourselves in this era?
Well, I want to first thank you for throwing me a softball question. That was very kind of you. I appreciate it.
Very easy. We'll solve this by the end of our 45 minutes.
Yeah. Well, I think we're dealing with the confluence of 2 trends. And this confluence is interesting, but it's also very troubling. And for our country, I think until recently, the lack of a coherent strategy has left us vulnerable. You talked about this, Gail, as being driven by technology, but I think it's being driven by 2 things: technology and national interest. So the technology part, I wouldn't say is easy, but it's very straightforward for us to understand. I was asked recently, what keeps me up at night, other than the fact we have a new dog who occasionally likes to jump into the bed, that keeps me up at night. But more seriously, we're going to have an entirely new cyber ecosystem created. 5G is going to create low latency, direct connectivity between billions more devices, which are not going to be mediated by local area networks, which are going to be very difficult for us to secure, or at least we're going to have to learn how to secure networks that we no longer own. They're going to be owned entirely by the 5G carriers. And the combination of 5G plus IP version 6 means that not only will there be more direct connectivity, there are going to be more devices. So we're going to be living in a world in which we have an entirely new cyber ecosystem from your house, your office, your factory, your hospital, university, your company, your manufacturing, and everything else will be connected directly to these 5G backbones. And we're going to have to figure that out. The other problem we'll have to figure out is how we secure this in a world in which the hardware is made not in the United States, but it's made elsewhere. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it also means that in a world of software addressable devices, we need to be sure how that's going to happen. So technology is pressing one end of this, and that is the new cyber ecosystem that we have to live in, that we have to know how to secure. Policy and national interest presses the other side. In the United States, cybersecurity is principally about the protection of our information. We're now beginning to think about it as the expression and the exercise of national power. And boy, are we late to that game.
Yep.
If you take a look at what China's doing, China looks at cyberspace as sovereign territory, and we do not. So if the world is going to live in a new cyber ecosystem created by 5G and IP version 6, and if that hardware isn't going to be made in the United States, and if, in fact, Americans and our allies and partners are going to live in a cyber ecosystem that somebody else creates, and that somebody else says, oh, by the way, just as we can create new sovereign territory out of islands and put airstrips on them, right, in the South China Sea, we may be able to create new sovereign territory. And since you didn't claim it, now we have. So we're going to have to learn how to secure ourselves not only in a new technologically enabled ecosystem, but one that is being shaped by the national interests of other countries, which look at cyberspace not as a domain for protection, but as a domain in which human conduct is regulated for sovereign purposes. That, I think, is the challenge. And if you want to admire a big, hairy problem, that's the one I put for you.
Well, I want to pause you on that because I want to get back to this discussion about a new cyber ecosystem and national interest with our two panelists on the end who've spent a lot of time thinking about both. But I'd like to go to Ilyas for a second to take us back to quantum, because we'll go back up and then we'll come down to from the 5,000-foot level. You mentioned that you hope to demystify some of the confusion around quantum. And actually, I know, Sam, you've talked about demystifying some of the discussion around cyber, right? And really trying to make this digestible to people. And I loved your quote that the whole subject of quantum mechanics is possessed of the most sublime beauty. Because I do think that that's not how most of the folks in this room would think about it, but there are many sides to this conversation. And I'm wondering if you can talk about why quantum matters to the folks in this room, to the work that they do, and also, how you think about the security questions around it.
Right, so I think that somebody earlier this morning on a panel mentioned, the lady from MIT, that the advent of quantum technologies, in addition to quantum computing, somehow the word disrupt doesn't do justice. And the reason for that is that we based and have based for the last 70 years, since Alan Turing and Claude Shannon and all the machines that have emanated since, on a basis that has become intuitive. We program, we decide what can and cannot be done based on the weight of 70 years of experience. We anticipate what might be done tomorrow based on the experiences of the last 5 and 10 years, regardless of the fact that the internet, etc., and Moore's law, of course, has contributed in a positive way to the speed of which can be achieved. The simple fact of the matter is that a quantum computer shifts that boundary. And there's nobody in this room, and there's nobody on the face of the planet who can tell you what truly can and cannot be done. There's a body of science, a body of research that can guide us as to where those boundaries will be shifted, but things that machines couldn't do will now be capable of being done. So I think that's a first point. And the second very quick point that I would make is that in the United Kingdom, we're onto our second round of really priming through the government support for quantum industries. Yesterday, we just announced a new package of support. And this is an area where actual experience outweighs opinion that might have been theoretic. In the last 1 year, since IBM has had its quantum computer online, it's a toy computer, but it's 5 qubits, and it's a real machine. Over 100,000 experiments have been done. Probably people that were born way after I was born, now know what can and can't be done intuitively using quantum machines. So I would say that these are the two guiding principles that I would bring to your attention. And as far as encryption and security is concerned, we must rewrite the rules.
Yeah.
Security is relative. So I use, and this is my last point, I use the example of a child in a room. If I have a 3-month-old infant in a room and I close the door, the room is secure. The infant will not get out. If the infant is a toddler of 3 years old, the toddler will walk up to the room and open it and walk out. Security is relative. Quantum security is the only technology that's ruled by the rules of the universe, which we won't get into, which provides absolute security. So we mustn't wait for when quantum computers, too many people say, oh, we're 10 years away. The fact of the matter is quantum technologies offers protection today, and that protection won't ever be bettered. And that's what we're beginning to discover.
Thank you. Steve, I want to talk to you. When Intel Federal was opened in 2011, there was a quote from the press release that said, reaching supercomputer performance levels of 100 times more powerful than today by 2018 will require the combined efforts of both industry and government. So I wonder about how you think about industry and government working together. And as somebody who has really seen both the need to design cutting-edge systems and the need to protect cutting-edge systems, how do you think about the convergence of those two ideas?
Well, I think if you look at it, it's almost looking at two sides of the coin. And let's take one of the emerging technologies that we're talking about today, throughout the day, which is AI.
Yeah.
And talk about how it's going to transform and disrupt a lot of industries, whether it be, as Mr. Work described this morning, the machine-to-human combatant team and the machine-to-machine combatant teams, to just autonomous vehicles, computer vision, better gaming. All these different industries will be disrupted by AI, and we're going to take advantage of that. We're seeing people start to talk, and we're just in the beginning stages of applying AI and machine learning to cybersecurity, and to be able to advance and automate and augment and eventually get to autonomous security capability sets to really thwart the sheer rise of threats. At the same time, you have to look at the other side of that coin. How do we protect those systems from themselves being attacked? Because as we become more reliant on these technologies for our everyday life and for our mission space, we have to be able to trust that they're making the right decisions,
right,
and that they've been programmed correctly, that the data they've been trained on did not have either inherent bias, accidental bias, or something that was even more coercive. And so we have to look at both sides. And I like the quote that I'm sure a lot of people here have heard, with great power comes great responsibility. And so we need to be able to get that level of trust into these systems, whether it be AI, quantum computing, and be able to understand the full system, the life cycle, if you will. Where did the data come from? What's that explainability of the AI? Can I prove that this decision was the right decision, or can I prove that the data that I put in to make those decisions came from a trusted source? We are just now starting to figure out all the different moving parts. We can say, well, I know this data. Well, do you? And we've seen great examples of where mistakes in bias have led to problems, whether it be the Uber example of training on fire trucks, and it hit a fire truck, but it didn't train on yellow fire truck, it only trained on red fire trucks. So there was some inherent bias in the data that was unobserved until after something had gone wrong. And so we need to be able to secure these systems to the same level that we want to use these technologies to better secure our lives. So there's that balance that we have to maintain, and it really crosses across all these technologies, whether it be 5G or IT. They're going to unleash this disruptive capability, but really only if we can build the trust in from the foundation. Otherwise, they will get ahead of us, as other technology innovations have done in the past.
Well, and I think that trust piece, you know, at SHIELD is something we think a lot about. I had not thought so deeply about the word trust until really thinking about technology, right? Which is, do we trust the data? Can we trust that the machines do exactly what we think they're going to do every time we work with them? And do we trust that we have the right people and the right talent in this conversation? And we were talking about this, Mike and Kathleen and I were talking about the role of trust. Kathleen, I want to just come to you and then go to Mike about this intersection of trust, technology, and tradecraft, right? And how do you think about the both analyzing the data and using technology to really help you get ahead of what the data is telling you?
Gail, thanks for the question. I think if I could make a military analogy, I would say technology is an unprecedented march. Trust is at parade rest, and that drives the question about talent. Because if there is a desynchronization, which there is, between the capabilities and technologies available in the private sector that attracts the young talent, and it's not available in the government, the young talent is going to be attracted to the government. I was struck by a compelling statistic that that DoD has 6.1, kind of funny math there, but 6.1 IT professionals over the age of 60 for every one under the age of 30, and that's a problem. We are missing a little bit of the ethos of service. 1% of the American populace serves in the military. Less than 15% of young millennials have a parent that served in the military. So that desynchronization of trust, search for relevance, and search for capabilities where they can discover and explore and innovate, I think, is broken. And if I might comment below the treetop level, from a practitioner's perspective, is what the things that used to keep law enforcement alive are awake at night were things like, gee, my undercover operation might get compromised if the bad guy knows I'm wearing a wire. Now it is the manipulation of high technology to compromise investigations, operations, individual police officers and federal agents and their families. What used to be considered a classified term, national technical means, are now available to adversaries and available at a fairly low price.
When you think about that whole discussion about talent, I guess I want to go to the threat piece, right, with Mike, which is that you have spent a lot of time thinking about artificial intelligence, thinking about machine learning, and how your team can think about a whole new set of threats that technology has created by also using technology to respond to those threats. When you think about your team and your talent, what have been the most significant impacts on the national security challenges that you've faced in Afghanistan, in Syria, and lots of other places, as they have evolved and as your understanding of what your team can do to respond to them has evolved alongside it?
Thanks for the question. If I could, before I tackle that, we were talking about trust, not just relationships, not just between organizations, but also between architectures and so forth. And I probably would have added a conversation about machine learning and supervised versus unsupervised learning and things that are challenging my former organization now and into the future, right? The leader development piece is critical. Hiring the right talent's important. The mid-level leadership is important too. And I've heard one of the individuals I met with out in California said, at the leadership level, it isn't about creation, it's about curation and so forth. And then make sure we hire that right talent. And then the senior leaders who are willing to underwrite risk, because we're going to make mistakes, right? Yeah. Some of the challenges that we bump into as we try to integrate what I would call elements of weak or narrow AI, things like machine learning or deep machine learning, natural language processing and so forth, is building trust. And so we have a cross-functional, multidisciplinary team. I think that's really important. They're not all coders, they're not all comp sci or physicists. You have a mix of intel and operators and so forth, and those engineers and those scientists are sitting over the shoulder of those operators. And we had a requirement in my previous organization to deliver something in under 2 years. And that kind of helps you frame the problem set, what you're able to do. Developing trust between the algorithms that are developed that are helping with either advanced analytics, pattern analysis, predictive analysis, modeling simulation, and so forth, is really hard to do real time. It's one thing if you've got folks off in a sandbox that are fenced in an innovation hub. It's another thing when you have to do it in contact, right? And building that trust with the scientists, with the algorithms, you talked about explainability, that's a huge challenge, right? Especially when you're delivering a product to the warfighter time now. And being able to explain how you derive that conclusion or that recommendation. And to the analysts they're tired, they're overwhelmed swimming in data. And they're comfortable with their set of tools. How do you integrate something new under that kind of, I would refer to as battle rhythm or tempo or so forth. That's a challenge too. I would tell you one of the ways that we try to come to grips with that is exhaustive effort with tech outreach. JIDO, Ditcher invest a lot of money in collaborating, if you will, with traditional and non-traditional mission partners. That could be anything from national laboratories to academia to foreign mission partners and so forth. I think we have to avoid hubris or intellectual arrogance. We aren't going to have all the answers, and that has to be okay. But we have to have the policy, it was mentioned earlier, policy in place to be able to share information across, I would say, U.S. government, whole of government. It's not just DOD, it's U.S. government. Similar wicked science problems that we're having, DHS and others are having as well. We have to find a way to work that piece. And quite honestly, the investment in technology and talent to help you mitigate some of those risks is really expensive. We don't have to go it alone. We can go it together in some regards, and we got to work that piece. But the non-traditional piece, I think, is really important as well. And that has to do with dealing with startups, foreign mission partners, organizations that were created such as DIUX in multiple locations. And of course, you've heard the Army stood up the new Modernization Command and so forth and things that they're doing. So the last thing is, first you need to understand the threat, then you need to understand the technology, but you have to have a plan, and you have to prepare, and you have to have a roadmap. So we've invested a lot of energy with building an AI integration roadmap. I just use the I word. It's one thing to have a technology or a thing. It's another thing to be able to integrate that thing. And so we spent a lot of energy trying to figure out how do we do that through the risk management framework and so forth. But you need to create an environment where there's an opportunity to fail because that's going to happen. And then from an investment perspective, we've got to be able to sustain it for the long run. And I think you're going to see this challenge between exploration and discovery and long-term investment, right? If we're solely driven by return on investment, it may take a while for some of the things we were talking about in quantum to materialize, and that's okay. But you can't just get solely focused on two letters, AI and quantum. The enabling technologies that underwrite all of that are dual and multi-use, and we have to pay attention to that too.
Well, and this is the thing, and I'd like to go back to Sam on this. We're asking organizations as they're dealing with the evolution of technology and the evolution of threats to do things that are a-traditional also. So we're asking a lot of organizations, and Sam, you were talking about supply chain and this whole new cyber ecosystem, and I wonder how you think about where parts are manufactured. The White House has done this industrial report recently about the industrial base. How do you think about the intersection of what is coming and where it is produced?
Sure. Well, first, it's a great question, and I'm going to do what many people do if they've been in Washington long enough. I'm going to thank you for that great question,
Yes.
and then go off and answer the question I wanted to answer. And
yes.
then when I come back, I'll make you acknowledge that I answered that question.
As long as
for
you come back, we'll let you stray.
Sure. So I will actually start with a question. There are some things that we can do. So first, even though the hardware is likely to be manufactured overseas by Ericsson and Nokia and Huawei, the microprocessors don't have to be. And the United States can continue to be a leader in the development and manufacture of the microprocessors that control these devices. On the other hand, we ought to be aware that a lot of research and development money is being spent elsewhere, and other countries want to assume leadership positions in the development and the manufacture of microprocessor devices. That means that we cannot be complacent. We can't just sit around on our tails and assume that we will sustain a leadership position. I can tell you that in quantum, we're not the only country that is trying to sustain a leadership position. I read an interesting paper in Science magazine yesterday. You know that the UK is working very hard. There should be no assumption that we are going to, that the excellence of our university system is going to leave us in the lead. This is something that requires research and development strategy at the national level. The second thing I would say is that there are ways of putting trust anchors into hardware. Microsoft has been doing this, Intel has been doing this, and there are ways of putting trust anchors in so that you can take a look at the chain of transactions throughout that. And I think that's something that we ought to consider, particularly as we move to IoT devices and 5G devices. Next, although I think many large organizations will not want to hear this necessarily, AI is important, and it's important for two reasons. One, we're going to need AI to be able to detect anomalous behavior in very complex networks. And we're going to have to be able to detect anomalous behavior in networks where we don't even know what their baseline behavior looks like, and where their baseline behavior is changing depending on the configuration or use of that network. So AI will be incredibly important. And we'll need to use AI to adjust our defenses dynamically, to learn about the environment in which we're operating. I think those technologies are emerging. People talk about AI being brittle, but the truth is that in commerce, AI is used for a lot of things, and it's being used very well, and it gets stronger every day. So I think, the combination of AI, trust anchors, sustaining and perhaps even amplifying our leadership in the world of microprocessors can really help us. And we're going to have to do it because the idea of owning our own network and securing our own network at our own periphery, that idea is going away. So enterprises will have to learn how to be secure on a network that they don't entirely control, and these are the things I think they can do to help them achieve that level of security.
Yeah, I mean, I think that raises this idea that we are in new terrain, right? And Ilias, you had written that the quantum threat comes just as the Internet of Things and 5G mobile connectivity are rising with higher security requirements than we've ever had before. There's a lot of talk about quantum encryption and various offensive and defensive methodologies. And I wonder, what are some of the specific applications and what promise do you think it holds in what time frame?
Can I do what Sam did?
Yes,
can
of course. And first you have to compliment the moderator for the question.
I live under your shadow. I just wanted to pick up on 2 points that I think are perhaps worth reiterating with respect. I think the proliferation of expertise in quantum technologies, quantum machine learning, I mean, we're just getting to grips with AI, never mind quantum machine learning, does require this duality. Trillions of dollars of existing infrastructure that serves our purpose today will not disappear. And I happen to believe, and I think the informed opinion is, that the best utilization of quantum computing and quantum resources in the early days, the next 10 years, will be in duality with existing networks. And I will give you perhaps one small example of that, is that all of these devices, whether we have drones or whether we have sensors coming up from the cars, or it doesn't matter what it is, this Internet of Things that will take advantage of 5G, these are not endowed with heavy processing power. And if we want to control our drone and not let somebody else control it, then we have to have a secure method of communication. And that is quantum. There is no alternative known at the moment to mankind. And that's a great example of duality. And that's not 10 years away, that's today. It is entirely possible to send an unhackable message to a dumb little, well, I say dumb, relatively dumb, device. So I just wanted to pick up on that. Just on encryption, I wanted to say that I'm sure that when the first cars or the first steam engine arrived, people were scared of it and didn't know what it was, and maybe it was magic or witchcraft. Quantum's no different. I think our children, my oldest is 13, by the time he's in his late 20s, he's not going to be scared of quantum, and we shouldn't be. It's not magic. These are real things. We know how to manipulate them. We've known for 100 years. It's only now that engineering is coming through. And I would say the two greatest short-term things that will happen in terms of usable technology on the encryption side. Firstly, I will say the ability of single-purpose devices to replace all of these algorithmic methods of protecting data, RSA, etc. I think that'll happen within the next 2 or 3 years, not 10 years. That's the first thing. And the second thing, of course, is quantum key distribution, which if we're going to have a quantum internet and a quantum internet of things, then this is inevitable. I happen to believe that this is a little bit further down the road, but certainly less than 10 years, in my opinion.
Well, and I think there's a whole discussion about timelines, but that is to our other T's. I wanted to go to Steve because you were talking about relatively dumb machines, and I would say to you that much of IoT depends on relatively dumb sensors, right? And as they collect data, what happens when the system that is processing the power at the edge is greater than the actual devices themselves? And how do you think about that? What's Intel doing? How do you think about how you approach that challenge?
I think there's a couple things to look at. So we use the term IoT because that's the sexy term today, but the idea of embedded systems and compute-capable devices have been around for a long time. And so really you have to look at it from both a brownfield or greenfield kind of approach. There are systems in place today. This room is filled with sensors. Not all of them, very few of them I'm sure are internet enabled, but they're generating data on a private network that then something is collecting. And as we put in new sensors, so as they add new light sensors to this room and new sensors to the clock that are internet enabled, there's going to be another system that's going to want to collect that data. The key thing to remember is that you don't want to be shipping all that data back to some cloud all the time.
Right.
It's not efficient, it's not cost effective, and really the answer is you want to be able to know what time it is right now. I'm looking at the clock, or whether or not to turn on the lights. You want to make a decision in real time. You don't want to wait on the latencies. This is where 5G is a transformational technology. It's going to unleash that data so we can get the data off the system. But really, it's more about how do we get computing closer to the data, closer to the edge, so we can make real-time decisions. And I think what Intel and others are doing in this space is about bridging that gap and understanding that it's about doing the right computations in the right place, whether that be inferencing in a computer vision use case, or it may just be conditional processing of lots of data feeds from multiple sensors. You want to be able to push what we call edge analytics is close to that edge, to the pointy end of the spear. And what we're seeing is that it's not, the term dumb sensor really is should be applied more to legacy sensors. The sensors that are being deployed today are by no means dumb and are more powerful than you can imagine. They may not be able to perform some of the massive parallel systems that you'd want to have a HANA in the cloud for, but you can take parts of that computational capability and deploy them right up at the edge, or in the back room in a small contained box to be able to do a lot of that processing where you need it at the time you need it. And so I think that's a key part of the story, is understanding that life cycle of data, making decisions at the edge, then being able to correlate data back to the back-end systems as needed, and understanding that life cycle and the approach. The flip side is you need to be able to secure those devices,
Right.
and that is a challenge. As much as I'd like to say that we want to have quantum encryption and everything, the keys that are involved are sometimes too big to fit inside a microphone sensor. So we have to figure out what's the right gateway or aggregation point to be able to say we can secure to here. And then we can do other things on the local area network of all the little sensors that maybe are too small or too nimble to have large keys and large encryption themselves, but I can uniquely identify them point to point, or I can behaviorally analyze them across a small network and use that to create my fingerprint for the local sensors and then have good security from the aggregation point back to the back end. And so it's understanding that there's no one silver bullet that I can apply and secure all my devices, but it's about deploying the right security at the right location and having the right capabilities to be able to deploy those. Roots of trust being a great example. Having a root of trust in a small sensor that then can communicate to the aggregation point, so you maintain that level of trust for the data collection, but then the data processing can add additional trust for the decision making.
Yeah, and that whole idea of AI on the edge is something we think about regularly as it comes to looking at the best information and how do you get it. And Kathleen wrote that when competing, the side that more rapidly and precisely extracts relevant truths, compensates for absent evidence, and creates decision quality knowledge wins. And that's something we think about a lot. And I want to go to that quote and think about, how do you rate the risks created by your adversaries having better information, and how does technology play a role there? How do you think about that?
Keeping with the protocol of the panel, thank you for a very good question. And actually, I'd like to comment before I answer that one directly to something Sam mentioned, and that is illuminating autonomous networks and adversarial networks. And I don't think that we have done an excellent job at that. We haven't enabled all the human senses that we have available, and I mean by that of the public, and having a receptivity to report anomalous behavior when it occurs. I spend a lot of my time in the active shooter, active threat realm, and what I've come to understand is that we have a culture that's adverse to risk, adverse to reporting something that just doesn't seem right or look right because we don't want to get in someone else's lane. It's human behavior. And we don't always have a system to make those reports. And as a result, bad behavior gets tolerated and it becomes almost invisible in a society. 2018 to date represents the highest number of active shooter events that we've had in recorded history. We're up to 20. Now there's been more than that if you were to include all the schools and all the universities, but 20 major events, the most recent of course, in the last week. We haven't automated our observables, and the latest FBI reporting will say that there's observable behavior in almost every single case of an active shooter, that a shooter will have 4 or 5 behaviors that are of concern. And what that means is there's an emotional leakage, There is a grievance collection process, and then there is a maladaptive approach to that. Listen, we're all grievance collectors. There's different things that bother people. I always joke about mine is speaking to machines. Press 1 for this answer, press 2 for this answer, and I either hang up in frustration or I press 0 till I speak to a human being. But I don't collect that grievance. I don't get really angry about it, and I have a pretty adaptive behavior. I stop that connection. But other folks will continue to collect the grievances, demonstrate behavior. Actually, 31% of them create something called the legacy token, which they'll signal in social media their intent to do harm. They'll do it with a manifesto, a video, a last will and testament, and they place that in social media in an automated way that somebody will see it. I don't think necessarily so they'll be interrupted, just so that they'll get credit for that event. And I think we can do a better job with high technology in automating those observables, making it okay to report that something just doesn't seem right or feel right, and not criticizing someone for being wrong. Fort Hood is a great example of a failure to report when all the indicators were omnipresent. So I think we can do a better job with our technology. I think we can enable and educate more people to report more regularly without fear of being ostracized, criticized, or fear of being wrong. And make security personal again. It really is an educational process and an engagement process by our citizenry.
When you think about that, can I just press you on the technology piece?
Certainly.
Because so much of this is the human element.
Indeed.
Right? Technology is both enabling people to share what they're going to do, but it is also in some ways enabling you to understand patterns. Do you see it playing both sides of the role? And then I want to go to Mike for the same thing.
I do. I think that any adversary has a patent of life, and if you have the strategic patience to examine that, you'll be able to see it. It is there. It is. We always talk about steganography, those opportunities to see things that are hidden in plain sight but invisible to the untrained eye, and it is training the technological sector and the human sector to be able to see those indicators that are present.
Yeah, yeah. And Mike, I just wanted to wrap up our discussion. One question to the group, and then I will take all of your questions.
Can I interject, though?
Yes, please.
I've been just dying to say this.
Absolutely.
So I think it's to Ilias. We were talking about duality, and I think the challenge that we're going to have going forward, certainly in the short to midterm, is understanding what classical does well, understanding what things like HPC and neural do well, and then potentially what it is, the potential or opportunity that quantum will do well. And having the wisdom to figure that out and to ask the exquisite question, because a lot of the challenges we'll bump into periodically is we're not asking the right questions of the capability that we've got, right? And so we have to figure out what is it we want classical computing to do for us, what is it we want high performance to do for us, or let's say convolutional neural networks to do for us, and what is it we potentially are going to want quantum to do for us. And it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to do everything well. And we just have to understand that and then move forward. I keep coming back to the roadmap because you have to have a plan and you have to prepare. But it is an all or nothing proposition.
Well, then let me just open this up to the panel before we take questions. This idea of a roadmap, how important is it to understand exactly where it is that you want to land before you begin, or or are you going to be confronted with the reality that the technology is going to evolve as your thinking does?
Can I start? And then, so I think the challenge is it's uncertainty. I don't think, I'll just as the former director, I'm not sure where it's going to land, honestly. The key is to be less wrong, right? And it requires, building a learning organization, adult homework, right? And the roadmap's important in terms of preparation and having a plan. But for us, it's been a challenge figuring out what comes out the other end of the roadmap. It's very difficult to predict. Is that fair?
If I could add to that, I think one thing, if you look back at every technological revolution in the last 20 years, and there's been many, they haven't been as big as maybe the Industrial Revolution or quantum will be, but whether it be wireless technologies, web, even the networks, right, for proliferation for mobile networks, we have always, as a society, jumped headfirst into the deep end of the ocean without thinking about risk, security, and the political, social impacts of these technologies. And then policy is like 12 light years behind that.
To Sam's point about policy.
And to think that we're ever going to change that model completely, I think we'd be kidding ourselves. However, we should start learning from past mistakes. And we may not be able to catch up because, again, technology is moving too quickly. But if we can plan for the fact that we're not going to catch up and get things moving and take those risks and be more risk-oriented in our approach to let's try to figure out how to secure AI, 5G, before it becomes so pervasive that it's too hard to deal with. And now you're dealing with a legacy problem of a technology that was only got introduced a year ago. I think we need to try to get ahead of the curve, knowing that we're not going to beat it. But if we just sort of take the stance of, oh, we can plan for it, and then we don't have to worry about it until it happens, we'll be behind again and again.
I want to add a point that we talk about our roadmap, what we're going to do. We have to be realistic. We in the United States, and I'm just speaking for our country, are 5% of the world's population. We're roughly 20% of the world's gross economic product. So it's not entirely up to us. Latest statistics put almost 4 billion people on the internet of 7.5 billion people. And there are only, 325 million people in the United States. So when we talk about a roadmap, we have to recognize that there are two competing, at least at the highest level, you can deconstruct this, visions of how this is going to happen. There's our approach to technology, which is to make it available and have people make of it what they will. And actually, it's worked out pretty well. It's enriched human existence, it's enriched human life, it's made connections and businesses and hobbies and interests and arts and things possible that were not nearly as possible. That's our approach. And we look at this as an open domain where we want to protect the rights of people to exploit that domain. Other countries look at that domain as one in which they intend to regulate human behavior. Cybersecurity isn't about the protection of information. It's about regulating human conduct just as you regulate human conduct on the streets of Beijing or the streets of Tehran. So we have to recognize that in addition to whatever roadmap that we conceive and any roadmap that we try to actualize, we have to live in a world where other people have different kinds of roadmaps. And whether or not we like it, our approach to our own security has to accommodate the fact that it exists. And with only 5% of the world's population, we're not going to be in a position to simply drive how this technology is employed elsewhere. But we are in a position to understand it and to make our own to develop our own strategy that either accommodates it or counteracts it, but certainly coexists with it. And we're going to have to do that.
I want to go to both chime in here, but also to take a question.
Sure. Well, if I may chime in first, please. Look, I have, some of you may be aware, I have the great privilege and honor of being the chairman of the Stephen Hawking Foundation. And Stephen, until recently, he of course passed away this year, felt that one of the great existential risks to humanity was sentient technology. You may agree, you may disagree with what Stephen says. I think he's one of the great minds that we've produced of the 10 billion or so people that have lived on this earth. Stephen is in a rarefied atmosphere. I think the point that he perhaps was alluding to is relevant to this point of principle. I actually think that the most important application of quantum computing is not cybersecurity or anything to do with security at all. And I think this development is happening today. The revolution we are living through, we're the equivalent of the people that lived through Stephenson's steam engine and didn't know it until 2 generations later. And that is quantum chemistry. Materials that allow us to generate energy from light. The ability to change Haber-Bosch so that we do not spend 5% of the world's energy on creating fertilizer. The ability to tell you that you need this drug and not some other drug. That is where, and I ask you all to think, in the next 5 years, how will your lives be changed by quantum? It will not be cybersecurity. Of course, we are preoccupied. We're part of the Western Alliance. That's why I'm sitting here. I guess that's why I was invited. And we are absolutely with the 5%. Our 0.1% is with yours. But so in that...
Thank you.
Yeah, no, but it's important. You've got to know what side you're on. But if you're asking in a bigger context what will change our lives and the lives of our children, it is quantum chemistry. And it's happening now, not 10 years from now.
The audience question is actually, and this would bring us home really was about exactly this, that you said your company designs solutions that will benefit from quantum computing. When the technology becomes more readily available, what will these solutions be able to accomplish that they currently cannot with traditional computing?
So I'll restrict it to 30 seconds. So there are around the world over 50 entities building or have built a quantum computer. One of the organizations is here, but you're doing the chips. So a very distinct minority are based in the United States. The key thing that matters is to turn this lump of metal into something that can compute. So my company is focused on operating systems that allow this to happen. The one technology that existing, so I would say two things in the last 10 seconds. The two technologies that existing classical computers are very constrained by. One example, of course, I just told you is quantum chemistry. And in 25 years' time, if there's free energy, I mean, what kind of impact does that have on our world? Yeah. Just a thought out there. And secondly, of course, quantum machine learning. Artificial intelligence is called artificial for a reason. It is artificial. These are approximations. And a good quantum system will transform what we can and can't realize from data.
I'm going to give the last question to Mike here, which is because we're talking about national security, and this is something we think about a lot. One of the audience questions was, what are the most important measures that U.S. national security community can take to maintain and advance its technology readiness? You've already talked about mistakes, so you've already talked about planning. What steps can be taken to maintain readiness, and how do you think about staying ahead of adversaries?
That's a great question. I'd like
and
to
I've
share.
And I've given you 35 seconds to finish.
Yeah, so we talked about leadership. That's going to be real important, you know, and in terms of how we get unity of effort, if you will, as we move forward. And then strategic and national guidance, which I think we talked about briefly. The ability to reach out to traditional, non-traditional mission partners. Yeah. And I think taking a look at our policies on information and tech sharing, right? It isn't just information sharing, it's data sharing as well. And then building a culture of creativity and innovation. And it may be in specialized hubs within the US government in different locations and so on and so forth, but that's going to be really important, the ability and the opportunity to take risk and to fail, but, and not to be short-sighted. There'll be periods where there's going to be a demand for return on investment, and it may not materialize. We may still be exploring versus discovering, and then the ability to integrate what we learn is going to be critical. I mentioned talent earlier. I had a fascinating conversation out in Silicon Valley. It seems like most of the kids coming out of college these days, if they've been in some STEM program, have coding skills. And so generally speaking, those that we're hiring from the last organization that are coming into this, they have skills in developing and writing algorithms and so forth. That's not a reach anymore. It's almost being normalized. And it's going all the way down to junior high, middle, and so on and so forth, right? That's the new normal. We talk about digital natives and so forth. They're going to be led for the time being by potential non-adapters or late arrivers, right? My generation and so forth. And so figuring out that balance and figuring out how do we bring in the mid-level leaders, right, to help us move forward in a mindful way. And you don't necessarily have to have all of the coders from the premier institutions. There are a lot of great coders from many different institutions. Leadership's going to be important, but the willingness to grind is going to be also important. And it's hard to teach that, you know. And then understanding that we are in a competition. There will be winners and losers, right? And we have to compete.
With that, I want to thank all of you. And I want to thank our tremendous panel, Kathleen, Mike, Sam, Amelia, Steve. Thank you very much for having a fascinating discussion.
And thank you, Gail. Yeah, and our distinguished panel. Thank you.